this talk is going to be this kind of return to one of these very big classics from critical pedagogy, critical theories of education, namely Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I'm going to bring into contact with inferentialist theories of education. Now, inferentialism as a theory of education, I was kind of connected to that marginally for a while, a few years back. Then I kind of took a break from it, and now I'm coming back for it for, well, this talk, and we'll see what else is going to happen, if anything. So I'm a little rusty, which you will find during the talk. So I'm going to, if I end up making strong pronouncements, this should be ascribed to the unsureness, the unsurety of my footing in this area as I return to it. I'm still figuring this out. So in that respect also I welcome, well, dialogue about this, as Freire would put it. Okay, so yeah, this paper stages a dialogue between Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy and inferentialist philosophy of education. Inferentialist philosophy of education is a developing body of research that draws on the work of Robert Brandom and Pittsburgh, neo-Hegelianism more broadly, to expand and reorient a social constructivist perspective on education. And it does this by emphasizing the role of embodied and intersubjective rationality. Despite its name, and as I implied just now, it draws inspiration not just from Robert Brandom's work, even though it's named after Brandom's work, but also from Wilfrid Sellers, John McDowell, and also McDowell's student David Backhurst. So besides like central concepts from Brandom, like the game of giving and asking for reasons, commitments, entitlements, norms, rules, etc., inferentialists also draw on McDowell's notions of second nature and Bildung. Now, so far, inferentialist philosophy of education has mainly focused first on developing what might be called like a sketch of a theory of cognition that is suitable for interpreting students' classroom activity. And this has included working out the epistemological and metaphysical presuppositions of such a theory. But it has also worked on operationalizing central inferentialist concepts, such as game of giving and asking for reasons, again, commitment, norm, rule, for use by educators in interpreting classroom activity. And also in developing design studies for use in the classroom. So, and inferentialists also, and I'll say more about this in a moment, have made practical recommendations as well. And these have centered around the need for educators to emphasize students' embodied, not abstract, reasoning activities, and to avoid problematic mind-world and mind-body dualisms in their pedagogy. Now, like I said, this talk is going to explore the possibilities of a transformative and critical inferential pedagogy, and this hasn't really been done so far as I know, but my focus is going to be conceptual more than anything. So there are large and surprising terminological overlaps between Freire and the inferentialist writings, and I'm going to highlight a few of these overlaps, and I'm going to ask, well, to what extent do we have a conceptual overlap hidden beneath this overlap in meaning, in terms. In doing this, I hope to clarify inferentialism's transformative potential, including maybe some of its current limitations when it comes to its transformative potential. And I'm going to begin by giving a broad overview of these overlaps, and then I'm going to hone in on three specific issues. One of these is Freire's emphasis on the transformation of reality. One of them is the nature of authority and also commitment in the classroom and on the part of teachers specifically. And thirdly, I will say a little bit on trust. So let's begin. This is what I've just said. I should say, so some of the main writings here, like I've said, so there's a foundational paper from 2011 by Arthur Bakker and Derry, who is there. There's a special issue from 2017 in this journal here that includes a bunch of papers on this. Ever since there has been, like, I would describe it as a trickle, maybe someone else would use a different term, but there's been a trickle of work coming out on inferentialism. And Bakkert's book, I wouldn't call this part of inferentialist pedagogy as such, but it has been an important inspiration from 2011, if I'm not mistaken, maybe earlier, I'm not sure. Okay, so let's go into these terminological overlaps. So, given that both of these theories, both Freire and inferentialism, have a kind of Hegelian pedigree, it's not surprising that we find several terminological points of connection. Firstly, most basically, both of them are committed to the idea that education aims at freedom and at the development of consciousness, although these concepts are also given predictably different interpretations by both of these theories. So for Brandom, consciousness is paradigmatically self-consciousness. And Brandom parses this as a kind of conceptual self-expressiveness, right? A kind of ability that is pragmatic and discursive to represent oneself as an accomplished player of the language game, as someone who is able to make explicit the rules by which the language game is played. Now, Freire's term, by contrast, conscientiezação, if I pronounce this correctly, which can be translated as either, it's often translated in terms of critical consciousness or the development, or conscientization would be a more literal rendering. This is instead a development of a critical awareness of one's own position in society, including in particular any oppressive structures in society. There's a bunch of other overlaps that I'm going to quickly mention. Freire is committed to what he calls the unity of praxis and theory, for the need for radicals to combine theory and action in their political work, basically, without separating these, without taking them as different kinds of activities that are unconnected, and without subsuming one of them to the other. As Freire puts it, and this is a quote, "There's no true word that is not at the same time a praxis." There's at least a distant reflection of this in inferentialism's intertwining of semantics and pragmatics. For Brandom, any saying can be understood at the same time as a doing, an intervention in the language game. So in this sense also there is a way in which for Brandom there cannot be reflection without action, and there cannot be action without at least potentially reflection here. Another point where you might find some overlap is Freire's famous criticism of the banking model of education. Freire condemned the treatment of education as though it were a one-sided transfer of knowledge understood as a kind of abstract commodity from the teacher to the passive student who is supposed to consume this commodity in this form. Now, we find nothing as specific as this in inferentialism, but we find similar ideas. We find a rejection of what is sometimes called instructionism in favor of a kind of constructivism. It's not exactly constructivism, it's a reformed constructivism. And also an emphasis on students' intersubjective mastery of knowledge practices. Inspired by constructivist pedagogy, we might say, even if it is also critical of it, inferentialism emphasizes the interaction between students amongst each other and between teacher and student in the process of learning. And it's similar to constructivist approaches to education. Okay, I'm going to say slightly more about this. So, inferentialism's main critical orientation so far has been toward what it sees as shortcomings of a reigning constructivist paradigm in education. Constructivism itself can be seen as a response to a prior representationalist paradigm. In this paradigm of representationalism, teaching is seen as an attempt to transfer representational contents from the teacher into the students' minds. Constructivism rejects this and instead stresses students' own abilities to construct meaning and knowledge. For inferentialism, however, constructivism is frequently at risk of taking a too narrow, as well as an insufficiently realist view of student learning. So, inferentialism might say, it matters how students construct their knowledge, as well as how their several constructions hang together. And it matters that these constructions are answerable to a shared reality between students, to which these representations, these constructed representations, give access, and which they do, after all, represent. So inferentialists see their alternative focus on not construction but judgment and reasoning as providing an important corrective to these constructivist shortcomings. So reasons here are to be understood very broadly, if you're familiar. I mean, this has been clear from previous talks already, I suppose. So it can be understood so broadly as to include, and this is again a quote, all motivators for human action, including the aesthetic, the effective, and even the ethical. This is from Katie Mackrell and David Pratt's 2017 paper. So one central pedagogical recommendation of inferentialism is therefore to privilege the inferential over the representational in learning. Understanding the inferential to include not just the individual student's cognition, but also their social environment. So it is asked that when teachers attend to the complexity of the individual meaning-making of learners, they also make the nature of the particular knowledge domain in which that meaning-making occurs, and the inferential roles that constitute concept meaning the focus of their attention. So, in other words, we also have a kind of holistic or relational understanding of concepts, right? Concepts are made up out of their inferential connections to other concepts. Now, what this shows is that there is already some potential in inferentialism, of course, for providing several normative prescriptions for how education should take place. So, I'm citing Jan here again, and she writes, a major contribution of inferentialism is to provide insight into the conditions in which good judgment emerges. In addition, by revealing the significance of normative constraints, responsiveness to reasons, and of social articulation to thinking and knowledge, it opens new possibilities for critically examining the appropriateness of pedagogical approaches and the presuppositions that inform them. Still, as is going to become clear now, inferentialism's understanding of norms, reasons, and social practices remains rather depoliticized relative to Freire. And the main way I'm going to bring this out, this difference between them, is by stressing on what Freire calls the true word and the significance of formulating the true word in education, and his emphasis on the object of knowledge as the transformation of reality. So let's get into that and explain what is meant by this. So this is going to be the starting point of the comparison here. So Freire has a triadic understanding of the relation between the teacher, the students, and the world between them. Freire insists that teaching is a collaborative effort between the teacher and the students, which respects and attempts to further the autonomy of both. So the teacher's goal is to help the students achieve a greater degree of subjectivity, consciousness, and freedom than they currently possess. For Freire, it is important that this process always respects the students' existing autonomy. As he puts it, the object of teaching, an object there is a technical term, is not the student or their knowledge, but the world in which both student and teacher are situated. So to bring this out, here are 3 quotations from Pedagogy of the Oppressed that relate to this. Firstly, Freire writes, dialogue is the encounter between, as he puts it, men, mediated by the world in order to name the world. If it is in speaking their word that people, by naming the world, transform it, dialogue, Freire's favorite method of education, imposes itself as the way by which they achieve significance as human beings. Dialogue is thus an existential necessity. In the second quote he adds, authentic education is not carried on by A for B or by A about B, but rather by A with B, mediated by the world, a world which impresses and challenges both parties, giving rise to views or opinions about this. And then finally, for the truly humanist educator and the authentic revolutionary, the object of action is the reality to be transformed by them together with other people, not other men and women themselves. So let me attempt to parse what is being said here. What Freire calls also humanist and also democratic teaching is a kind of teaching that respects the autonomy of the student and empowers the student to become a co-constructor of knowledge. that is to say, to participate in naming the world. It takes as its objects of change not the students per se, but the world around them. In doing so, it also allows these objects to mediate the relation between subjects. In other words, Freire insists that the objects of knowledge is taken in teaching not as something that is inert or passive or ideal or decontextualized, but that it serves as an opportunity for both the development of student capacities and for their understanding of the world that they live in. In doing so, the object becomes, as he puts it, with another technical term, a problem. And Freire's problem-posing method of education is intended to always present the content that is to be taught, at least in principle, as opening up into wider socio-political questions. So it's always embedded in this social context that includes oppressive relations, and so teaching can always enter into discussion of these. I mean, not just discussion, but actual contestation and transformation of these oppressive realities. Now, the question here is quite simple. From my perspective, it's just, can inferentialist pedagogy accommodate this thought of Freire, that the object of teaching is the transformation of reality? And now there are two ways in which it can try to do so. Firstly, it can try to do so by going down the route of Brandom's ideas, and then secondly, it can try to do so by going down the route of more of McDowell's ideas. But Brandom's and McDowell's well-known disagreements precisely about the nature and status of reality have the result in this context, I think, that neither of these options ends up being really satisfactory. To put it very simply, probably too simply, but there we go. There is too little world in Brandom's thought, but there is rather too much world in McDowell's thought. So in Brandom, it becomes difficult to see how you can change the world without first changing your fellow speakers. And in McDowell, it's difficult to see how the world can be a subject of transformation at all, or an object of transformation at all. So I'm going to go through these two options in slightly more detail now. So for Brandom, we might say that it's not the world that mediates the relation between subjects, but on the contrary, it's subjects who between them mediate the world. This is the upshot of the theory of representation, I would say, that he develops in the final chapter of Making It Explicit. So for Brandom, reality is the object of de re speech, speech that intends to represent reality, right? And for this reason, its correct representation is to be determined from within the language game. And that's Brandom's view on this. Even though external reality is capable of exercising a kind of external constraint on the functioning of the language game, that's the only function it performs, right? It doesn't become a direct object of representation. So there have been many criticisms of this theory, including by the already mentioned David Bakker. It has been criticized for having an insufficiently robust notion of objectivity. I mean, we might mention McDowell here as well, obviously. My problem here is that it seems to understand reality as too constitutively bound up with the language game. So Freire calls idealist, I'm not sure if I have that quote, no. Okay, so Freire refers in a pejorative sense to people as an idealist if they, and this is a quote, affirm that by merely reflecting an oppressive society and discovering their status as objects, persons have thereby already become subjects, end quote. So the idea is that for transformation of reality, right, for political change, it is sufficient to be aware of oppression without having to do anything about this. Now, my worry is that Brandom's view maybe risks being idealist in this sense, because for him, a political commitment against oppression appears to remain within the language game entirely. So if we look at Brandom's most explicit statements advocating for social change, you see that these are always phrased in terms of the introduction of new vocabularies, right? New ways of talking about reality. We might want something that is a little bit more direct and a little bit more hands-on with reality itself. So subjecthood for Brandom does not involve a commitment to transformation of political reality. Instead, the development of subjecthood is the institution of political reality for Brandom. But in this way, the sense in which political reality is up to us as object of political action vanishes, because this sense of its transformability is subsumed into the more banal sense of social reality being simply a social institution. Hence, of social reality being a social institution, right? As Brandom puts this, he calls this often a creature of our attitudes, right? Social reality is just something that happens when we have attitudes towards each other. So Brandom commendably emphasizes contestation in this model of discursive scorekeeping with each other, right? This is kind of people keeping track of each other and contesting each other's interpretations of reality. This is a placing of contestation at the heart of what he calls the fine structure of autonomy and recognition. But the particular way in which he does so nevertheless seems to deny the role of power by eliding the distinction between oppression and more innocent or even legitimate forms of disagreement. So it seems that irreducibly there are ways of being false that we cannot just reduce to failing to play by the rules of the language game. So take an example. Suppose I am a racist. So the falsity in my saying, for example, that some humans are better than others, or some kinds of humans are better than others, is not simply that in doing so I fail to abide by conversational pragmatics, we might say. I mean, one problem of actually existing oppression is that often this is a perfectly acceptable thing to say in conversation, at least among certain kinds of people. So I might not be disrespecting conversational pragmatics. If my conversational partner is someone who belongs to the same higher kind of being as myself, then there's nothing wrong with this conversational move of mine between the two of us. Now, there's a response that Brandom can make here. Brandom can say, well, you know, after all, there is a kind of immanent force in thinking itself that pushes me to balance out my authoritative claims with responsibility that I take up towards others and that I acknowledge in others. But this seems like a rather too abstract attempt to capture what is wrong with my social hierarchical claim. So the problem with that claim, I would say, is rather that it just expresses a false way of being, a constellation of attitudes and actions that has to be opposed as a whole. And the recommendation that I'm making here is that, well, if we look to Freire, we can maybe make sense of how this kind of thing happens. But if we focus on Brandom alone, we might not have the conceptual repertoire in order to accommodate this point. Okay, so that's Brandom. Then McDowell. Too much world in McDowell, if you remember. My worry is that with McDowell, instead we go into the opposite direction. It seems that a McDowellian understanding of reality might lead to an inflation of reality's objectivity to the point where it becomes difficult to see how it can be an object of transformation at all. For McDowell, reality as the object of political action is connected first of all with human second nature, as he puts it, right? Where second nature I'm parsing as like the set of cognitive and practical abilities that humans develop in society as part of their natural development. Reality also appears for McDowell as the source of the norms that well-developed human judgment takes itself to be constrained by. But in this naturalization, as he puts it, after all, of normativity and judgment, it seems that the sense of there being a possible, of these norms and rules being a possible object of transformation also disappears. So there's a quote by Bakker that I think tends in this direction. So he writes, responsiveness to reasons is a matter of our attunement to the normative contours of our environment, or to the topography of the space of reasons, as McDowell might say. We become free in acquiring a second nature because we thereby attain the capacity to navigate the space of reasons. There's a problem with metaphors here. There's a problem with, McDowell often uses perceptual metaphors when he's talking about norms, right? We kind of perceive these things, but things that we perceive often,
They seem to be things that are there independently of our perception. That's an issue. The metaphor of attunement here is similar, right? There are already these normative contours. What matters is that we attune ourselves to them, something that we have to do, but reality doesn't have to change for this. Topography, you might also say, that's a kind of like a map-making metaphor. Maps also are taken to represent things that are there independent of map-making practices. So, putting this together, normative contours by Bakker are presented as being basically given to us, not as an object of transformation. Given, I mean, not in an objectionable Salargian sense, but given just in the sense that they confront us, as it were. They are given to us as something that we encounter in the world, but not as something that we create or constitute. And this suggests, or this can suggest a picture that Freire objects to. So becoming free on that picture seems to be a matter of entering into relation with reality and then transforming others, right? Getting them to also become perceptive to the existing norms and the social structures. And not, on the contrary, one of entering into relation with others in the name of a transformation of reality, as Freire would have us do. So, I mean, that is one way of filling out this picture. Another way, but not much better perhaps, is that we have a picture here where political contestation is just not part of the human life form, such that to realize this life form has no intrinsic connection with the development of any particular political organization. Freire would object to this. He would say that this is to separate the question of freedom and self-consciousness from questions of dehumanization, precisely, right? Because this is one of his targets in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He says oppression dehumanizes people, such that to become human is to overcome oppression. And this appears to be a problem for McDowell, therefore. Okay, so this is my main big claim. Inferentialist pedagogy needs to develop the tools to think about the transformation of reality as part of teaching, as a natural part of education and the development of human consciousness. So I have two more points, but these are going to be much shorter. I want to say a little bit about commitment and authority, and I want to say a little bit about trust. And mainly with commitment and authority, my main point is just to compare and contrast Brandom's own, I would say, not abstract, but maybe rather formalistic representations of what commitment and authority appeal to, and then contrast them with the way Freire fills out these same notions in his work. So, and I have quotes for this. Yeah. So here again we find a lot of unexpected overlap, at least unexpected to me. So for Brandom, authority is a normative status, right? I'm guessing most of you know this. It's a normative status that can be self-claimed, but ultimately it's dependent for its existence to others' acknowledgement. So his strong claim is that the recognition by others of oneself as justified in claiming this authority is constitutive of authority as such. That means that ultimately it's impossible to have authority without this kind of recognition by others, right? But as Brandom realizes, or as Brandom's Hegel realizes, it turns out that many people still want to claim this kind of authority nevertheless. So in his recent book, A Spirit of Trust, there are long discussions of how people come to claim authority without making the proper recognitive moves there, recognizing other people's role in the constitution of authority. Yeah, and the same thing is true for commitments. So we can stake a commitment to a certain claim, right? This is more the terminology of making it explicit. To do this, we have to be entitled to making this commitment, but this entitlement also is due to, ultimately dependent on other people's acknowledgements. So commitment here, so there are two claims here. There's a very strong symmetrical claim that always for any kind of commitment I claim, you know, if I want to truly be justified in claiming it, there has to be an entitlement there on the part of someone else who is in the language game with me. That's one point. And as a result of this, commitment and entitlement become strongly
and authority as well, become strongly relational, right? Dependent on for their existence on other people. It's difficult to translate this kind of talk of commitments and authorities to a classroom setting. I think I remember actually discussions about this back in the day when I was still part of this inferentialist group of people working together on this. It's hard to figure out what is happening in a classroom when, for example, a teacher has a kind of authority, right? Does the teacher owe their authority to its acknowledgement by the students? Well, maybe, but that seems like, what happens when the students don't want to acknowledge this authority? What role does the issue play that the students maybe themselves are still in the development as normative, self-conscious players of the language game, right? Does that mean that they actually can extend this authority? That they can acknowledge this authority? If they can't do that, then is the authority of the teacher badly founded? Because that seems to be the kind of implication that we are going towards here. So what I want to do here, this isn't really a very well thought out argument. I just want to point out that Freire has discussions of commitment and authority in his work, and that he presents these attitudes as not so immediately relationally dependent on other people's acknowledgement, and as something that is more existentially grounded in the teacher's self-conception, and maybe in the teacher's own nature as an autonomous subject. So there are just a few lines. These first two quotes we can skip. It's just him saying something that sounds very Brandomian, which is that only humans can commit themselves to their actions, right? So only humans can have a kind of understanding of themselves as the object of their reflection, and animals can't. The latter two quotes are more important for commitment, I would say. So commitment for Freire is intrinsically political commitment. He writes, "My very presence in the school as a teacher is intrinsically a political presence, something that students cannot possibly ignore." From the same book, Pedagogy of Freedom, later on he writes, "It's for this reason that the teaching of contents undertaken critically involves the teacher's total commitment to the legitimate attempt by the student to take in hand the responsibility of being a knowing subject. Even more than that, it involves the initiative of a teacher committed to the adventure of bringing to birth in the student a person at ease who can articulate that might be a typo, who can articulate his or her subjectivity." Basically, this issue of commitment is a confrontation between two subjects who are, as Freire, represented by Freire, as already implicitly autonomous and already present and capable of some kind of reflection on themselves as committed entities. And when it comes to authority, the issue is quite similar. So just one quote. So Freire's dialogical theory of action. There's an emphasis here on how authority and freedom are correlative terms for Freire, so we can't have one without the other, and they're opposed to more extreme versions of the same thing. So Freire wants authority but not authoritarianism. He wants freedom but not license, right? Like arbitrary freedom to do whatever you want. So he writes, "The dialogical theory of action opposes both authoritarianism and license, and thereby affirms authority and freedom. There's no freedom without authority, but there's also no authority without freedom. Authentic authority is not affirmed as such by a mere transfer of power, but through delegation or in sympathetic adherence." This is not a denial of authority on the part of the teacher. The teacher is supposed to have authority, and maybe this authority is not entirely acknowledged by students or is not dependent for its existence on students' acknowledgements. Of course, we want this authority to be acknowledged after all, right? But this isn't a metaphysical claim, it's a more practical claim that in asserting one's authority, one is trying to work with the students, as it were. But that's not to say that this authority depends on other students, on the students, in the way that the Brandomian picture seems to suggest here. Okay. So that's just one way of working out a comparison between the way these two terms function in these two different theories. I'm going to end very soon. I'm going to end very soon by talking a bit about trust. So Freire talks also about students, for example, contesting authority of the teacher in the classroom and then negotiating the norms by which the teacher's authority is supposed to work out. But this doesn't work out in precisely the formalistic way that we find in Brandom. Anyway, a few final points about trust and community. Yeah, can I take? Can I take 5 minutes?
We won't have time for questions.
Can I just make a chair's intervention? So we're slightly behind. Jan's after Ruben. So if you have questions for Ruben, could you make a note of them, and then we'll do all the questions at the end. I think that might be.
No, it's fine actually. I can finish in 2 minutes, and then we can have maybe 5 minutes for questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Okay. So trust, basically. There's a whole story in the spirit of trust, Brandom's latest book, where trust is a forward-looking attitude and is understood by him as a precondition of ultimately fully justified participation in the language game. It's just really interesting when we read Freire that he presents this explicitly as not something that's presupposed in dialogue, but is the consequence of dialogue. So trust isn't something that we have to presuppose as we enter into the language game. It's something that we work out together as we participate in the language game, and we find that we can trust each other. And that's a quite different kind of perspective, I would say, with important other political implications also for the role of trust in free, autonomous, dialogical teaching. Okay, so let me just wrap up really quickly. I've given just a sketch of some of the ways that inferentialism and Freire's thought can be brought into contact with each other. It's been at a pretty high level of abstraction. I've emphasized disagreements also at the risk of probably exaggerating some of them, because I just think it would be good for inferentialists to think about how to incorporate a more critical perspective on education. So if we wanted to emphasize, or if we wanted to summarize the difference between Freire and inferentialism in 2 words, especially between Freire and Brandom in 2 words, we might say that Freire has what we might call a critical perspective, but inferentialism has a transcendental perspective. So when they are talking about freedom, consciousness, commitment, trust, all these concepts, Freire positions these as political concepts. He's not unaware of the role these concepts play in human communities or human self-understanding, but his focus is on how we can use these concepts, how we can realize these concepts, and how they can be used to transform existing political reality. But inferentialism has a kind of single-minded emphasis on questions about the constitution of freedom, consciousness, and norms. So Brandom's claim is that a well-constituted discursive practice, which includes classroom practices, right, is going to be a free one. Any well-constituted discursive practice will be free. This is a claim about the necessary preconditions for autonomy and consciousness, but in Brandom these are identified with the necessary preconditions for language as such. Now, I think that looking at Freire's thought shows that this picture is too simple. It fails to give an adequate role to reality as a possible object of political transformation. And this failure is connected with a failure to adequately theorize what might be called false, oppressive language games, right? Untrue words, as opposed to the true word that Freire is looking into. So human linguistic abilities and second nature, I think, must be either given a more substantive and political interpretation by inferentialists, or the realization of true freedom and true self-consciousness must require something more than Brandom or McDowell can, as of yet, give them. And that's it. Thank you.
So
2 minutes for questions.
yes, just if you have questions, could you make an effort to keep them briefly formulated? So we've got a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to Jan. So are there any questions for Ruben?
It's not so much a real question, but it was more the notion of institution. That
up in my head in your presentation as a necessary nodal point that can be used to offer also in the dialogue between those thinkers, in a sense, the necessity to think about the organization of institutions in relation to those the discussion that you've just set up.
Right.
It's just a general remark in how could that notion of the institution be of use in this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing to begin to explore. I mean, this also in Brandom is supposed to happen kind of, I mean, it's supposed to be emergent, right, from human attitudes kind of contrasting with each other, and that institutes normative statuses and norms, etc. Yeah, of course, you might have a much more concrete and realistic, I mean, realistic is a tendentious term there, but you might have a more concretely worked out picture of how people actually come to institute social relations between each other and work these out politically. Yeah, so that's, but I have nothing more concrete to say about that at this point, but yeah, that's a good idea to explore. Yeah, thanks.
Any other? Yeah.
So you mentioned that Brandom reduces or sort of conflates consciousness and self-consciousness. This is something I noticed some time ago, and I find it quite alarming. Brandom, why do you think that? Why do you think he makes this? Why do you think he makes this conflation? And is it a mistake, or can you justify it?
Okay. What is the alarming thing about it? Is it that I am conflating this when ascribing it to Brandom, or that Brandom is conflating it himself?
I think you're absolutely right in identifying it, and that's something I noticed a while back. I can't quite understand why he does this.
Yeah, good.
So I'm alarmed at him.
Yeah, good. That's reassuring. I mean, Brandom would say that he doesn't do this, right? Brandom would say, oh, I have an important distinction between Kantian consciousness and Hegelian self-consciousness, where Kantian consciousness is the ability to use concepts and Hegelian self-consciousness is the ability to represent myself as using concepts. So he would say that there's no conflation there, and I was actually being a little bit tendentious in ascribing this to him. But, of course, he thinks there is, as I called it, like an immanent kind of force pushing you towards saying that you can't really use concepts unless you can actually represent concepts, represent yourself as concepts. And that's a weird thing about him. I'm not really sure why he does that. We can talk about this later, maybe.
Okay.
Because I think we are out of time.